We are getting stuck into iteration 2. Very exciting. Jacob asked a question already during the break, which was, for anyone who's started iteration 2, is it manageable if you have a pretty good understanding of last week's lecture? Absolutely. Last week's lecture is more than enough to pretty much do all of iteration 2. The only thing that was missing was this persistence lecture, which was like 8 lines of code. So you are more than well equipped, and it is time to get started now because it is due in 17, 18 days, 18 days or something crazy, right? So time will fly. This lecture doesn't really have slides because we're just here to help you out with iteration 2. For iteration 0 and iteration 1, we had so much to talk about in the course that we decided to make these pre-recorded videos for you, where you would kind of go away and watch them in your own time. But for iteration 2, because the course is starting to get a little bit lighter, because we're kind of making up for putting pressure on you so early on, we like to spend the actual lecture time going through it. Because remember, every pre-recorded video you watch is more time out of your day you have to go and deal with, right? So today's like the pre-recorded videos for iteration 0 and iteration 1. There's nothing fancy about it. We're just using the time we already have. Now, iteration 2 was pushed to you on... also, by the way, is there anyone in this lecture, anyone from a group who hasn't started iteration 2? Because I will use your repo as an example of maybe what to look at. We won't look at your code or anything. I mean, even if we did, I guess that would be my fault, not yours, so it wouldn't matter. But Jacob hasn't. Jacob, what group are you in? Do you want to tell me what group you're in? And we'll look up your group. We can look up your group. We can do that. Groups. T17C egg. Thank you, by the way. You must have very, very low lag. It's remarkably quick. So Jacob is from T17C eggs. And what'll happen, right? What'll happen with iteration 2 and has already happened is that we push out a merge request to you. Now, we have actually pushed out a few of them. Actually, is there any other group names? I'm sure there's some groups who haven't merged it in. I can have a quick look. I'll pick a few random groups. See if any groups haven't actually merged it in. There we go. Okay, so there's this one group here called H15B Boost. And H15B Boost, and this is for everyone, they have this whole merge request thing here. And they've got 5, right? Now, the reason they have 5 is because every time we push an update to you, it's a very, very, very long story. But there used to be some problems with how we would push updates to your repos, but we fixed them, and things are much smoother, 100 times easier to merge things in and deal with conflicts than they used to be. You're living in the golden age, but one of the downsides is that every time we push it, it kind of creates a new merge request. So most of you would have figured this out already, but just to recap for the groups that haven't, what this means is that we've made 4 updates to the spec, minor updates in the last couple of days. All you ever have to do, you can technically merge them in one at a time if you'd like to, but generally all you have to do is look at the last one. So you can come here, and you'll see that in this case, the group has to resolve some merge conflicts, in which case, you follow the resolve locally instructions, or you just clone it and you look at it, and maybe just to be really clear again, because I know some groups struggle with it, it's like, let's say I'm this group, and I'm on your H15B boost project, right? So I'm going to come here, I'm going to clone the repo, because I'm the group. I probably will get a conflict. Right, so let's say I clone this particular repo. It's like, great. Now what it's saying to me is this merge request that we have created to merge into your repository, it's actually got a particular branch name. It has a random generated branch name, which is up here. It's this one up here. And what I can do is I can actually go and check out that branch. So I can go check out, just like you would check out another branch locally. Oh, sorry, let me get inside the folder. So I check out that branch locally, right? Now what I could do in this is that, if you remember back from week 1, I'm on so if you imagine visually now, you've got yourself master over here, which is, where your code base is at, and then you've got update something, which is what we've pushed to you. So if you want to fix merge conflicts, the easiest thing to do typically is you go and check out this branch, right? And then you go and ask master to get merged into this branch, and you try and resolve those conflicts there. So if I go git merge master, because I'm on the update branch now, we'll get a few conflicts. And you see this one's actually remarkably straightforward. So if I come here and I go to package, you can see that it's only in package.json. If I go and open that, you can see that most of the conflicts come from some of the dependencies here. Now the way again to read these merge conflicts is typically the head means like head means top, which means most recent, right? So what this is saying is that head is what we've added for you, and this stuff is what you had. So if I was a group here, what I would typically do is I would say, well, okay, the course pushed this stuff. The course people probably know what they're doing, so I'm going to go and keep that. So I'm going to go and like, just treat that like it's normally there. But then I look at some of the stuff I have here, like rewire and validator, and I think, well, I don't remember if they're useful or not. What I'd probably just recommend you do generally is you just delete most of it, because you probably don't need anything. And it's very easy to go back and add stuff again. So that's probably what I'd recommend you do in that case, is you just like delete what you had there. And if you delete what you have there, then what you do is you can now kind of go and push and update this branch. Now, for this particular group, I hope someone watches the lecture, because I'm probably just going to do it for them because it's a little bit easier. So I guess if it's your group, then... Oh, wait, is this T7? No, this is the H15B boost. If anyone knows who's in H15B boost, I'll look that up later. Sorry, but I'm sure no one will complain too much. But what I do now is I'm like, okay, I've solved that. I will go and, resolve conflict in package.json. Can always just reset your history if I really want to. And then I'll go push that up to that particular branch, right? So I'm basically updating the branch here that we tried to push in. And now when you come to this page, it will let you merge it in. So what you can do is you can delete it or whatever. Delete source branch. And then it says, merge when pipeline succeeds, which, maybe it may or may not succeed, and you can kind of go and play that out if you want to, but you could click merge when pipeline succeeds. It might take a while to run. It might fail. If it fails, you can kind of go look into it. You can see here it's just running tests so far. It's like waiting for the job, but the point is that you only need to merge in the latest one. For the other ones here, sometimes they'll delete themselves. But in general, what you can do is if you ever kind of take so long to merge in these things, not that this one was particularly long, you can just go open these and you can just go and close them, because you only need the most recent one. So they're all kind of closed, and that like cleans up your page a bit. So you've just got this one here. So this one is now just kind of waiting to actually, run essentially. But that's the first step in kind of taking in those changes for iteration 2. Some groups have really complicated merge conflicts, which are just based on just a coincidence of how they did their work. Some groups don't have any issues with merge conflicts at all, and things just merge in seamlessly. Some groups are like this one, where there's just like one or two things to touch. This is probably a pretty common one, where there's just a little bit to fix up, and then you're all good. So while that's just kind of ruminating there, trying to figure out if it can merge or not, because sometimes the pipelines can be slow, as you've probably seen, let's go and have a look at the actual spec. So iteration 2 is just like iteration 1, where we closed off iteration 0, we moved on to iteration 1, but this time we're closing off iteration 1 and moving on to iteration 2. And what you'll notice, just like the previous ones, is that the iteration, the iteration, oh, it hasn't been merged in yet, that's why, sorry. So the spec will update, obviously, once the merge request passes, but at the moment it hasn't. Naturally, if you'd ever like to look at the spec early, you can pretty much just go to the commits here, and you can have a look at like whatever commit exists. You can do this. I can click on this commit, and then from there I can click on what can I click on? I always forget how GitLab works. I can usually just look at a file and then play around with that file, but it escapes me at the moment. Commits, files, something. You can usually just look up a commit. I'll play around with it later. But if you have any problems, we can always just post it on the forum. It's not particularly hard. View file. There's the file. Now I'm on that branch, of course. That's it. You just check out that branch. That was really silly of me. You can just go to that particular branch, and here's the file. So we can actually just like look at the spec together, right? So you don't actually have to have it merged in to look at the spec. But iteration 2 is called building a web server. And essentially, in this iteration, we are focused on doing two really key things. One is that we are focused on adding more functionality to your particular project, right? Whereby previously, like in iteration 1, you maybe just had like 10 or something functions, and in iteration 2, we are going to try and add like just a little bit more in terms of like what it can do, maybe like double or something. And then we're also going to turn it into an HTTP server, so it's not just functions, but it's an actual server. So if we have a look here and we say, well, okay, well, let's look at what we actually have to do, because there's a series of steps that we ask you to do for this iteration. The first one is that we say, make adjustments to your existing code if your tutor gave you any feedback from iteration 1. So if they were like, you need to fix this before you start, you probably need to go and do that. Now, in many cases, there's probably not a lot for you to do, so you probably don't need to worry and you probably don't need to stress. So you can mostly skip that one. The next one is really important and it has to be done, but it's actually really simple, which is that you just need to go and open up all of your files that are all JavaScript files, the ones you wrote, basically the ones in the source folder, and you just need to go and rename them to .ts, right? Now what we've done as part of this iteration is we've actually created 2 files here, which is echo.ts and also echotest.ts, just to kind of, play things around a little bit. But all you need to do is go in here and just change these files. So you're just going to move, like I could open it in the editor. I could go and just like do it like this, move auth.test.js to auth.test.ts, like just cycle through it like this. It feels a little silly, but you know what? It takes all of like 1 minute, .js to channels.ts. We're nearly there. It's not hard. You can look at how many JavaScript files do I have now? Not many, just 5. So we'll move datastore.js to datastore.ts. Move other.js to other.ts. We'll move users.js to users.ts. And then lastly, users.test.ts to users.test.js to ts. Okay, so we've done all of that, right? Now that's just because from iteration 2, you're working with TypeScript. So that change is really critical. So we've done that, and then we look here and it says, okay, below is a sample conversion of this from that. Now, you can go and add all those types. You don't necessarily need to add them to start. Let's see how it goes without it. We don't want to stress you out with it. But let's get to the actual meat and bones of iteration 3, which is to implement and test an HTTP Express server according to the interface below. We will auto-mark this section just like the previous one. We will ask you to do a few things that we'll get to in more details. But most of this here is just saying like build a server. That's do the work, right? So pretty much all of iteration 2 is that section 3 of just building the server. We're also going to ask you to lint your code with a lint command that we'll also talk about. We're also asking you in iteration 2 to like make sure you follow Git practices and project management practices, because there is marks for actually going and working on the task board and having stand-ups and doing meetings and all those kinds of things. And your tutor will mark you on that. And then the last one, which is recommended but not required, as we've talked about, is that we want you to remove type errors in your code using the TSC command that we talked about back in week 3, which type checks your code to make sure that everything is type safe. So there's a bit to unpack in this iteration, but it's also a much longer iteration, right? This project started for you. You had 3 weeks to do iteration 0 and iteration 1 altogether. This time, you have 3 weeks to do the entirety of iteration 2. So you've got quite a lot of time on your hands. The other thing about iteration 2 is that a front end has been built and is given to you to run with for iteration 2. So there's not just a web server that you have to build, but there's actually a front end that we have written that is powered by your server so that you can play around with it. So there's a few things again to unpack here, but let's just kind of keep going through it so you can get comfortable with the actual iteration. So 4.2, more stuff here. You can run your server anytime, which we have actually started for you. In fact, let me go and clone this particular group. Let me go and clone this group in VLab so we can like open up the files together, right? So if I come back here, make another folder. Here we'll git clone this group, suite, h15, was it project backend, like that. And then I'll open up the text editor for us, so we can start playing around with it in this folder. Okay, so there's our project backend. Now, it says that we can run our server just by doing npm start, except I'm probably going to have to install it first. Oh, once again, the problem here is that I'm still on the master branch because, I didn't actually like go and, that's a commit. What branch do I want? Oh, it's all very confusing sometimes, isn't it? Here you go. I want this particular branch. Obviously, if your merge request has been merged in, you don't need to like go and think about this at all. But I will go and check out this update, whatever it's called, branch here. like on the machine. So I'm going to go say, git checkout, just for fun for the moment. I'm going to go check out that branch, and we've got all this stuff here. Now, what we gave you actually, if you go and look at your code, is there's actually a file created called server.ts. Server.ts has got a lot of stuff in it that maybe isn't too familiar to you compared to maybe like what you saw in the lectures last week, but it all makes a great deal of sense. So this is an Express server, and it has one route at the moment, which is echo. It's a get route, and the get route, all it does is it simply takes in a variable from the query, from the URL, and it returns a JSON response that just contains the echo of that query. So it's really, really simple. And most of this route here has a few little oddball stuff, but you don't need to worry too much about it. If I come here now and I go npm start, it's probably not going to work because I haven't installed anything, because remember, when you clone an npm repo, the first thing you need to do is actually go and npm install it so that you download all the packages. So right now we're just downloading all those packages from npm. You're probably very, very familiar with this by now because you probably run npm install quite a few times. Npm install, by the way, it's actually quicker if you've done it before, because when you install stuff, it actually caches those modules on your computer. So if you were to go and delete node modules and then re-npm install, it would detect that it's downloaded some already for you, and it would just go and like dump them. You wouldn't need to do a lot. So now that I've got that, I can run npm start. Now npm start will start the server for you, and we can go and see what it does by opening our package.json, and you'll see that when we run npm start, it runs ts node on that file. So npm start is literally equivalent to npm run ts node on source/server.ts. Very similar to what we've been doing in previous lectures, except it's not ts. Oh, what is it? Sorry. Well, this would be if I put ts node here. So if we did what we did previously and we just kind of like set the ts node there, this would now work, and we would actually be running the server properly like that. So I've got the server now, and it's got port 3200, and you know what? I can actually go and like make a request on that port if I want to. We can play around with that. We know that there's this echo route, so let's say I go and make a new route here. If I want to, I'll just click on this one. We'll just modify it. So on port 3200, /echo is the route. That's what's written in the source code, right? /echo, and you can see that it takes in a query parameter called echo. So from a GET request perspective, I could just go, well, the query parameter echo and is Hayden. So I'm going to make that GET request echo is Hayden. I click send, it sends back Hayden. So that's like a route that you can use just to test with. Like if you can run that server and you have that route, like you're like, sweet. And that didn't take me long, right? Like I was really explaining myself there, but the time it took to kind of deal with that merge conflict and just check out that branch while we wait for it to merge and just to run that server after an npm install and just to run that route, it was like 10 minutes max. Probably could have done it in a few minutes if I wasn't talking so much crap the whole time. Matu says, is the REST client necessary for us? It's very necessary. Well, not very, like it's generally quite useful because it's how you can actually debug your HTTP server, because a web browser can only do GET requests. And you can do all the code stuff we did, the sync request library, but sometimes it's just easier to use something like ARC and an API client instead of going and, writing code to solve all the problems all the time. Jed, you approved my merge request for our repo. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Cool. So we've got a few other things here. Let's just quickly unpack them. This cause thing is for some weird server security stuff that comes up. Most of this here is fairly similar. This is just like, these are collecting the ports and the host. Okay. Most of this you don't need to care about, but the short story is that for us to auto mark these servers, there are a few things that we needed to do so that we could actually run your servers on GitLab as part of the pipelines. Kind of this whole process.env stuff and this sigint stuff, a lot of this is just based on that. This here is to help log errors. So most of the stuff you see here is not really anything you need to learn and make sense of. It's actually just there to like improve your experience. It's stuff we've added to over time. But mostly all you do is you take this server and you just start going and writing routes. Like we've seen in the previous lecture where you say app.get like this, and what do we write? We're at data, and that was like request response and stuff like this. And I could have a data route, and all it's going to do is go response.json hello or something like this, right? It's just going to return some object that has hello twice, and I can just restart my server here, and I'm sure that will work fine. I can just call / what was it? /hello? Is that what it was? You can see there when I tried to call /hello, it gave me a 404 error, which is saying that, there's actually a problem. There is no hello because I called it /data. So it's like, oh, okay, cool. /data, send. Okay, so I got my hello back. So see how easy it is? Like we just write routes like that. Super, super easy. A quick moment to recap on HTTP errors. So there's basically 4 types of errors 4 types of responses you will come across. Right? See how this one says 200 okay here? So there's a few. There's 200, there's going to be 400, 404, and 500. 200 means all good. It worked, right? And we saw that before. Anytime you make a request and it works, it'll say 200. 400 and I think 403 for that matter. These ones are basically saying you, the person making the request, made a mistake. And this is the server basically rejecting your request. Or like you sent it stuff and it was like not good enough. Sorry, try again. So they're like errors of input. 404 means that the route doesn't exist. So that basically means that you've either mistyped something or you thought the server had a route that it doesn't. And 500, and this one's really important, this means that the server had an error. So if you see 500 when you make a request, what that means is that you screwed up your server. Like there's a bug in your code. Go and check that out. It's probably not a mistake necessarily with the input you're giving it or the route name or something like that. So that's quite important. If we look back to the spec here. Okay, so we've started the server. That's really easy. You'll see I haven't had to do much TypeScript here. As we mentioned last week, it's very forgiving with a lot of the TypeScript. You don't need to waste too much time on it. Then it says implementing and testing features. Okay, this is just a copy from the previous iteration, right? And the previous iteration here pretty much was just, create a branch, write some tests, do some features. So I don't need to go over that because you're already quite familiar with that. The next one though, testing the interface, is quite relevant because it's a little bit different from the last iteration. The testing itself follows the same principle. You're using Jest, you're writing tests for implementations you haven't done yet, but then you will do. It's just the difference is that this time, all of the testing you do is in Jest. So for instance, here we have a server that has an echo route, and you'll see that this echo route, it captures the data from the URL and it returns a JSON response, but what it returns is a function call to a function called echo, which was imported from a file called echo, right? And that file here, all it does is it checks if the value is echo, and if it is, it returns error. Otherwise, it returns the value. So this is that thing I was talking about kind of wrapping your functions, where what you actually have to do here is just like, you can go and take all of your functions you've written from the previous iteration, and you can just go and wrap them like this and call it in the server. But within my test, if you have a look at the test file, I'm still using Jest with the describe and the test, but I'm actually making HTTP requests now. So what this means is that you kind of have to go and like rip up the tests you've written for iteration 1, but not delete them or anything, but just change how they're expressed. You have to do what we call refactoring your code, which is instead of just, doing a standard expect and calling a function, it's going to call a route instead. So in this case, there's 2 sample tests we've given you, which is that we are going to make a GET request to to our URL, right, on that port to echo. Now you might be like, well, what's all this URL port stuff? Well, we just added a file called config.json, right, where config.json just defines the URL and the port. You can go and change that anytime. We've created like a central file for you like that. So it'll on that URL, on that port, call echo. It'll add that to the URL. We get the response, and we expect the response to be okay. That's just something you can write to. That's like it worked. And then we expect what it gave back to just be the text hello. This line here isn't super necessary. You can kind of not worry about that too much. So, that's up to you really. But like, it's fine if you don't have that for the moment. The main thing is just testing that the output makes sense. So now what this means is that to test it, I do what we did last week. I run my server in one terminal. And then over here I come along and I go, well, let's run our tests now. But we've got this nice, in our package.json here, we've got this nice expression test, which will actually just test everything for us. So in my first terminal, even though I wrote this fancy command, I only ever really needed to write npm start. And then over here, all I need to do is write npm test, and that will test against my server. Got some problems. That's okay. We'll take a look at that later. Few funny things, but that's pretty much it. All you really need to do, you make sure we got everything right here. It's all good. Come back to that. That'll do exactly what we did last week, which is that it'll essentially go and run our tests for us. So where's the wrong file? Wrong editor? Yeah. So it'll take these tests, it'll run it, it'll come back and say passed or not passed, and everything should be fine. One thing you'll actually notice, it's very subtle, I often forget this, but one of the advantages of TypeScript is that it's this kind of super language of JavaScript, and you'll actually notice that TypeScript is smart enough to actually import a JSON file and automatically convert it. Because if you were paying attention, you notice that we imported JSON and we extracted the port and the URL from it, but we never had to do any like JSON parse or anything like that. That's because, you know, TypeScript is smart enough to go and say, well, I can see what's in that file, I can decode it, I can make sense of it like this. And there we go. So that's how we write tests in this particular iteration. It's very similar, it's just the syntax is different. But fundamentally, we're calling a function with arguments and we are expecting a response from that function, and we check to see if it matches what we expect it to be. That's the full extent of it, right? So very, very manageable there. We'll go play around with that example again at the end. I don't want to get lost on a debugging rampage. Okay, the next thing, continuous integration. So with the introduction of linting into the project, during this iteration, you can actually add in things to the .gitlab CI file. So what that means is that the default one we gave you for iteration 2 is very simple. All it does is it basically starts your server, and it's not basic, but you don't need to worry about it too much. It actually starts your server and tests it. So it's actually the equivalent of like just the test element, just running jest. But you can enhance this further if you'd like to. Your group can, and we probably recommend you do, which is around the linting. So if you remember, another thing we introduced in iteration 2 is the linting, because we added this eslintrc file to your repo, where if you run npm run lint, it will go and tell you all the problems with your code as far as the lint is concerned. So this particular group's got some problems with their code. That's okay, that's pretty normal. And if you also remember from the previous lecture, we're tying a few concepts here together. There's another command we gave you, which is lintfix. And lintfix will go through and fix everything humanly possible for you, like that. But there are some things it doesn't know how to fix. For instance, it won't rename variables. It won't know how to deal with mixed spaces and tabs. It'll want you to change double equals to triple equals. And you can go and change all those things, and you can keep running that command if you'd like to. But what we're also saying is that you could come along here if you want to, and you could say, actually, I'm going to add a new part to my, and you could just copy and paste this literally. Stage is checks, and the script is just going to be npm run lint, like that. So you could add that to the pipeline now, so that with your pipeline, it will go and lint your code. So if someone actually tries to merge code into master that is not linted properly, it will come up with the red cross and be like, no, you can't merge that code in, it's not linted properly. Jacob says, so iteration 2 is just testing our functions through a server and actually storing the data. Yes, exactly, but as you'll see in a sec, there's actually more work to do still. So there's a conversion element of it that's like a little bit of refactoring and learning about what's going on, but there is also a real part of actually like writing more stuff. So it's just taking you through it still. We've done the testing part. We've talked about that you can add stuff with continuous integration. We've got this recommended approach, which is like pretty much a summary of what's above. We have this storing data part, which is just the persistence remark, where we basically say to you that we expect you to like store things persistently, but we just did that in the last lecture, so you should be able to make sense of that pretty well. The next parts, I think I won't comment on, because I'll be able to comment on it when we look at the next section, so we'll leave that alone for now. There's another dry run for this iteration, so just like the previous iteration, all you need to do is you just need to clone your repo to a CSE machine, like we have here, and then you just need to run 1531 dry run 2, and that should work, hopefully. Yep, you passed 0 out of 4 tests. Good job. Mostly not there. The dry run is not here to go and like handhold you the whole way. It's just here to sanity check it, right? So just to be clear, the dry one was created about a year ago. I asked for it not because I wanted groups to be told everything they did exactly right or wrong. I did it because we get a lot of stress right before submission. The leaderboard helped with this as well, of course, but we want you to know if you're if you're passing 4 out of 4 basic dry run tests, then it's like, great, you are on track and you haven't done something absolutely terrible. So that's just standard. Now the marking criteria for iteration 2 is there's slightly more to talk about. So thankfully, structurally, it's very similar. There's a huge auto marking component where we go and look at your code and we automatically run it, and that mark's determined by a computer. But the other two marks are not to do with that. They're actually kind of softer things that they're irrespective of the performance of your code. And the first one is code quality, which is 30%, which is, the exact same thing as last time. Do your tests have like good coverage? Do they test lots of different things? Are the tests clear? Is the test design thoughtful? Have you used the right JavaScript data structures? Have you used like good software design processes? Did you implement persistence correctly? Lots and lots and lots of stuff. And then we also have 20% for Git and project management. So that's, again, all the same stuff as iteration 1. Good commit names, at least 12 merge requests into master, GitLab board, or like some kind of board in general, stand-ups and everything else. So this should all be pretty much the same. Where the subtlety comes into play is just on how we're marking the auto mark. Very similar to iteration 1, where we simply multiply your tests against your code and our tests against your code. So exactly the same as iteration 1. It's just that instead of that multiplier here, t times I, being 100% of the mark, we make it only 95% of the mark because we want to carve out 5% for linting. Linting is an all or nothing mark, as in we will give you all that 5% or none of that 5%, right? And it's such an easy mark to get because you should know if it's okay before you submit it, right? Like iteration 2 is like 35% of the course, and the project itself is, 0.6 of the course, so it's 60%. So iteration 2 is 21% of the course, and if you go and get 0.5% of that, you are looking at, or like 5% of that, sorry, I don't think that was exactly right. It's not a lot of marks overall in the course, right? It's like 1 mark in the course. 1 mark comes from linting. So sometimes groups message me and they're like, oh, we should get partial marks, like 2 out of 5 or something. But it's like, if you actually do the math, it just starts to get quite granular. So it's just an all or nothing mark. Either you have no linting issues and you get 5 marks for it, or you have some linting issues and you get none. So make sure, because that's the easiest marks you'll probably get in the course. We have peer assessment, just like in other iterations, which you'll do at the end. But that's a lot of iteration 2. There's quite a few things to unpack and take in there, but it's all fairly manageable if you just take the time to step through it. It's one of those things where if you just sit down for an hour and you just kind of look through it, you'll be like, okay, this is all very manageable. I kind of understand what's happening here. All good, all well, and everything else. Now, as we move on to section 5, which is the interface specifications, this is something you're familiar with from the previous iteration. But there's a few things to point out here. The first one to point out is that the interface has changed slightly in the sense that instead of a function name, you now have a route. So instead of saying auth login v1 or something as a function, it says auth/login/v2. And the other thing you'll see is that there's an HTTP method here. So all of these will say to you, okay, well, and if it's get, it'll say query and body. So it's just slight changes, but it's all the same stuff. Like all of this has mostly stayed the same. One thing you will notice though, is that most of the routes have v2 in them instead of v1. This is again something introduced a year or so ago, where what happens in reality is that when someone creates an API, like a set of functions or a set of routes with a particular behavior, when someone goes to modify that, they don't just go and modify the code. They actually create a copy of it typically, and that copy will have a different version on it. And that's so that you can push out a new version while people still use the old version for a while before you remove it. So in that sense, this is just kind of to be a little bit more like market standard. But in reality, it doesn't mean you have to go and create 2 copies of anything. It just changes like what you might write. So for instance, if you're starting iteration 2 now, and you want to go and create a new route, you might open your server.ts file here. You come down here and you say, well, I'm going to make a post request, which is auth/login/v2 with request response. And I know that it's going to take in an email and a password from the body. So I can do that here. I can say const. I can destructure it if I want to. I could say email password equals request.body like that. And I know that it's going to return a token and an auth user ID, which is more stuff to unpack. So I know that the response object I'm going to send back is just token. We'll just placeholder that with an empty string. And auth user ID will placeholder that with an empty integer, right? And all I have to do here is actually go and call my auth login v1. So for instance, and I don't want to steal this group's work, but I can probably just import auth login v1 from their auth file, right? Because they've gone and done an auth file. Oh, Daniel says, why don't routes begin with /? They do. Sorry, that's probably just a mistake. I don't know if they have to. I'm not sure what happens if you don't have that. I think they just read into it anyway. But so what I'm doing here is the group has written auth login v1 from iteration 1 already. So they can just go and import that. And we saw this before. They can go and say, well, I'm just going to call that function and I'm just going to pass in the email and the password. And this function now needs to return. Sorry. Gives me some stuff back that I'm going to return. So maybe that, gives me back a token and that gives me back an auth user ID. Now, if we actually go back to iteration 1 for a second, right? Let me go back to master here. Let's just compare the interface table for a minute. So this is back, this is iteration 1. And when we come down to the interface table, you'll see that auth login v1, it actually only returned an auth user ID before, whereas now it's returning this magical thing called a token. So in a few cases, you will actually have to change how the function works slightly, but it's never major. It's never like we go and get you to rip up everything completely. There are just some slight modifications. And that's also why you see it go to v2 here. We don't just change things to v2 arbitrarily. If you actually go through the routes, you'll see that the only things that have changed to v2 are things that take in different input. You'll notice that clear has stayed the same compared to iteration 1. So clear is identical. It just says clear/v1 because nothing about it has changed, whereas most of the other routes have a very slight change in them. And that very slight change means that we might need a different approach here. So lots of similar things. Most of these routes you'll see are exactly the same. But for iteration 2, we've also added more routes. And there's quite a few more. Not a ton. Like we've been very kind of careful about how we balance these things. But you will see that some of them include that for this iteration, you can now log out. You can now leave a channel. You can add an owner and remove an owner from a channel. You can send a message, edit a message, remove a message. You can also create a DM, like a direct message, not a channel, but like, to a couple people. You can get all the DM lists. You can remove a DM, see the details of a DM, leave a DM, see the messages in a DM, send a DM, stuff like that. So it's a lot of like just messaging elements. You can also go and list all the users in your particular Beans app. You can also go and change someone's profile email, their profile name, or their profile handle. There's actually not a ton, to be perfectly honest with you. Like the scope of that is very manageable for 3 weeks, right? For a typical group, they've probably done most of the hard learning in the last iteration 1. So again, we saw this before. I kind of just mostly implemented this. The one thing that this won't work is obviously they'd have to go and modify the auth login to be different, to like return this token thing that we'll kind of get to in a second. But if we keep going, you'll see that this stuff is all from iteration 1, like valid email, testing, pagination, permissions. I'm trying to remember if it's from iteration 1 or what does it have? Where's permissions? Permissions, yeah, from iteration 1. But there's a few new sections here that require reading, in particular 3. Well, 2 actually. There's only 2. The first one is on user sessions. User sessions is fairly involved, right? And we'll come back to that because it's probably one of the more meaningful parts of the iteration change. But is that working at the moment? Probably not. But one other key part about iteration 2 is that we want your code working with a front end. And we'll just quickly demonstrate for you too. But there's actually a front-end repo that everyone has access to that you can go and clone. And you don't have to do this till like the end of your iteration. But what you can do is that, let's say I'm running my server here, right? So I'll run my server. You can in another terminal. Oh, what's it complaining about? Am I already running something, am I? Okay, let's try it again. Someone's probably already using... See, this is that port thing I mentioned before. Someone's using that port now, probably because a student has cloned their repo. So I can just change that to like port 3250 or something. I can just change that and it'll run on a different port now. So what I'm going to do is, that's my back end. There's a course provided front end that I'm going to go and clone here, right? Project front end. And inside here, there's actually instructions here about how to run it. It says, okay, the easiest way is to simply run npm install. Okay, that's easy enough. So I'll come here and I'll run npm install, just like they said. Super cool. And then they say to run bash run easy, and then the iteration number, and then the port that the backend's running on. Okay, well that also sounds straightforward enough. This will take a moment to install because there's quite a lot of like packages that are being run here. There's a lot to unpack on the front end. So, give it a minute. Ignore all those security warnings and other things that probably seem a little bit scary. Oh, security vulnerability. It's all right. No one's using this for anything important. Give it a minute. Now I go and I run this bash run easy and I said iteration 2 and then the port my server's running on is 3250. And what that'll do is that'll actually open up, that'll go and start a server where it's like I can go and like copy this and it's actually like running the front end. So if I go and like take that and I copy it, what I can do is I can go and open a web browser here and I can run that. And this is actually a front end. And this won't work at the start, right? Because if you try and run it, right, if I try and like log in, or like even better, let's try and register. Right, I try and register with, Hayden Smith and my email address and like a password. Like that. It won't work. It'll give me an error. Like you can see there, it just doesn't work. I can see what's going on here if I want to. This is again a quick tangent. I'm kind of front loading you with information that you might want to come back to and reference throughout the iteration 2. So don't feel like overwhelmed by it. But if you actually like right click on Chromium and you go to inspect, and then you come up here and you click on this network tab, when you actually try to do something, it'll actually kind of give you these little errors and stuff. This is like the front end trying to talk to your server, right? So last week what we did was we like wrote code, and we have it right here still. We wrote code that actually tries to talk to a server like this. But a web page is actually just exactly like this. It's trying to do that for us. So when I clicked that request, it actually tried to make that, and it wasn't very happy. And there was an error, basically. There was an error when trying to get that information. And it couldn't find it, is the short answer. There was like a problem here where it just like couldn't find it. So you can actually see if like what requests are happening here. Like, if I click sign up or something, or, I enter some BS along the way, that probably won't work either. But yep, so same thing. It's like, yep, okay, some stuff failed. That one probably shouldn't have failed, but you'll get to that. We'll talk about that in future lectures and stuff because, well, in week 7 a little bit. Because most of you shouldn't worry about the front end for a while. Like, you should feel like you've done 80% of it and then worry about the front end. So it's kind of like a typical life cycle would be, you go and do all your tests implementation, you write more and more tests, you feel like you're comfortable with it, and then like when you get maybe 2/3 through, start running it with the front end. Because obviously, you're going to need a certain critical mass of things working so that the front end will actually behave for you. Otherwise, nothing's going to work exactly right. So that's important to get right. That's the front end. Great. We just talked about the front end. Where is it? It's just here. Yes, it is called, yeah, it's just an old URL. It's just easy to keep the URL. So there is actually an app that's deployed. You can actually go and look at this. You can go and register if you'd like to. So if I try it here, let's say like Hayden Smith, and we'll try and like create an account, and I go sign up. You can actually see what it kind of looks like. And this is really useful if you say want to actually get a more tactile feel for what you're doing, because it's very abstract what we've done in iteration 1, right? But it's actually really simple. You are building an application. Someone has built an interface for it that wants to be powered by the code you're writing. So when this front end here that someone else wrote, when someone comes along and says, I want to create a channel called giraffes, and you go and create it, right? The actual creating of that channel and the opening of that channel and, the sending of a message in that channel, all of that happens because of a server that was written like yours. Like we took a previous group server that did it, and this is powering that, all the inviting and the leaving and all that other stuff you've seen, in iteration, like I don't know how to modify this here exactly. Invite member or leave channel. I guess you can't in this particular case, but that's really what we're dealing with. So it's just that's what the front end is in this particular iteration. There aren't any marks for the front end as far as I know. I'm pretty sure I took them out. Nope, we decided to keep them in. That makes sense. The reason we want to keep the front end stuff in is because it really helps groups focus. Because what can happen is that the front end is like another leaderboard in a way. Like you can write tests that you think are good, and your code passes those tests, but when you put it in the leaderboard, it all goes to hell because your tests suck or your tests were mistaken or something's wrong with it. But the front end's kind of the same. You could write tests that you think work and they pass, like they pass your code, but then when your code runs on the front end, if the front end doesn't work, it's because you've misinterpreted the spec or something's gone wrong. So getting the front end working is something that's important to this iteration. It's just you can worry about it at the end. You don't have to worry about it at the start, right? That's the main thing. Due dates, Friday of week 7. All pretty straightforward. Submitting's the same. Individual contributions, check-ins, all of this is exactly the same. Peer assessments the same. Auto marking, leaderboard is all the same, right? All of that's the same. So nothing too much to worry about. The last thing that we kind of glossed over is probably this user sessions element. This is something that there's no computer science concept that we have to teach for you to do this. You are well equipped to solve this problem because all it's using is, it's like persistence, right? We already taught you how to write a file. We already taught you how to make an HTTP server. We taught you how to decode and encode JSON. The persistence lecture was really like, let's just, now that we've taught you everything you need to know, let's just give you a little helpful bump because we're feeling really generous. This user sessions thing is something that we don't kind of spoon feed you necessarily because we want you to think about it a little more. But basically what it's saying, I'll give you the nutshell, is that let's say that someone logs in. So I'm over here on like computer 1, right? I'll call it computer 1. And then let's say I'm over here on like computer 2. Let's just call it like mobile 1. So maybe I'm on my laptop and maybe I'm on my mobile at the same time. What happens right now is that when I log in on computer 1, right, what I get given back as a user ID, let's imagine my user ID is 123. But what happens is right now, or based on iteration 1, if I also then logged in on my mobile, it would give me back my user ID, which is 123. But when, say, I on my computer, on my laptop, went to log out of user 123, all the server nodes that exist is actually just user 123. So the only way that you could actually code your backend to work for a logout right now is to kind of log out everyone, It doesn't really make sense. In fact, you can't log someone out because the way the actual kind of client-server interaction works is that you come along over here, like let's imagine you're like a website and this is the server. So the website says, hey, I've got a request for you. Hayden wants to log in. His username is like hayden.smith@UNSW. His password is like Cadbury or something. And the server looks up the password, and you did this in iteration 1, and it's like, yep, that's Hayden. Here, I'll give you back their user ID. And then the website's like, great, thanks. That user ID is really helpful. And then you also know this from iteration 1. What happens there is that later on the website says, hey, Hayden actually really wants to create a new channel. Can you create a new channel for him? Like new channel. And by the way, here's his user ID. So you know who he is. He's 123. And the server goes, yep, great. I know who 123 is. It's Hayden. Thanks. I'll go and create that channel. And like all good, tick, tick, tick. Everyone's happy. The problems with this are that you can't really log someone out, because like once you give someone a user ID, they could just keep trying to do stuff forever. But any application you build, people need the ability to like be able to be logged out. Like they have to, be kind of kicked out of the system. And you can't do it like this because you can't log out a user ID because it's just forever. How would you know if someone's logged in? So what you actually need is this idea of session management, which is a way of saying, well, when Hayden logs in, so if we just unwind for a second, when you give me, his email and his password and it works, I'm not going to give you back his user ID, or more specifically, I'm not just going to give you back his user ID, but I'm going to give you back what we call a token. And this token is essentially some kind of unique identifier. Could be anything. Let's imagine it's like 5 characters. Like that. SEDFF. And what happens is on your server, somewhere in your data store, you've got all these different users. And you've got the user Hayden here. And you know that Hayden has an ID, which is, 123. But Hayden's also got some sessions. And the sessions that he's on might be like SEDFF, like this, So they're kind of keeping a list of sessions. And the reason this is very important and this is very powerful is because what happens is now when the website goes to, create a channel and it says, yep, okay, there's a new channel. Oh, by the way, the session ID for this is SEDFF. the server's like, okay, session ID SEDFF. Let's go and look at that. Yep, I can see that that's Hayden's session. I know who. Okay, Hayden's logged in right now. Okay, all good. I'll go and create that channel. All sweet. But then what happens is the website's like, actually, hey server, Hayden just asked me to log out. So can you like log out SEDFF? And the server's like, yep, I can log out SEDFF. Hayden comes along, or the server comes along and says, yep, sweet. We'll just go and like remove that session from that array. And now Hayden's not logged in anywhere anymore. And if he logs in two places, we can kind of have two sessions at the same time and log one out and keep. This is how you can use Facebook on your phone and log out on your laptop, but it stays on your phone. It's a very simple idea. It's just that this session ID is basically what we're calling a token, right? So what that means is that for iteration 1, when you logged in or registered someone, you just gave back a user ID, right? And when you made one of the subsequent requests to like create a channel or to modify a channel or something, you just gave that user ID. But what we're doing this iteration is like the same thing. You're getting something back. It's just instead of it being a user ID, it's what we call a token, and that token contains information defined by you about the particular session that request pertains to. So I log in, you give me back a token. So like a typical thing, like here's what it might look like. I call login, and you give me back this, for instance. And this is probably what is an easy one to do. You give me back a token, which let's just say it's an object where it has session, and session is SEDFF or something like that. And you also give me back an auth user ID, which might be like my 123. So that's actually what I get back from the auth login or the auth register. This is still a useful thing if you want it, but it's not necessary. That's more just there for consistency. But this session is now quite interesting because your login and register are giving a session back when returning, not just a user ID. And on each request you make, you will also notice that on all the subsequent requests now, that if we go to the interface table, which is up here, that all those requests now take in a token, not an auth user ID. So they're not interested in the they're not interested in the auth user ID anymore, because it's also easy to fake that, like once I know your user ID forever, it's like giving someone your driver's license number. If they know that, they just know it forever, until you like go and change it, which is like really hard to do. But we give a token instead, which is just the session data, right? It's whatever auth register returned. It's nothing different, right? Like if we go up here, it's the same as iteration 1. It returned something, we gave it back. So auth register and auth login both return a token. So that's what the token part is. I've been talking for quite a while now. We've been 52 minutes into this iteration 2 brief, and I feel like I think I've talked more about iteration 2 this term, I think, unless I'm just crazy, than I have in previous terms. So it's probably hopefully been very helpful. Basically touched on every element of it, really. Probably the only thing just to quickly mention is that mentioned up the top when the iteration 2 starting, when it's like we recommend removing any type errors in your code, and we've talked previously about the bonus marks that'll give you in the project. All that really means is that at some point when you're feeling settled, instead of just linting your code, you can also run npm run tsc, which will work. And this will give you all the type errors that exist in your code, which in this case is nothing somehow. It's probably nothing. I don't know. That's weird. Seems a bit alarming. I can't imagine it's all that perfect. There's probably some things that are causing that to be the case. Have a think about that later, but no, I don't know. It's probably to do with like where it's probably in the TS config, right? Is it? Don't know. It's probably fine. But the point is that if you pass that without any issues, then you're in good stead. And if you don't pass it, then you can fix them up, but you're not required to. But we'd strongly recommend it because it'll give you free marks later with the bonus marks as well. Jed says, is token randomly generated or regularly? Look, it's about as randomly generated as the user ID. Like you could, I want to be really clear here. So a token is just a package, right? But what's inside the package is probably just going to be some session information. So let's call it like, session ID SEDFF. So I just want to be really clear on the language here. It's like this is the token and this is like the session. So like the session is just the data inside here, but the token is the object. Token is like the whole like package of information, but typically your package of information will just include the session ID anyway. So it's easy to talk about them be the same, and your tutors, frankly, will probably talk about them pretty similarly. They'll be like, oh yeah, the session and the token and stuff, but formally the token is the string you get back, because the token is the token is generally going to be like some kind of like JSON string or something. You technically don't need to do this. Like you could literally just have the token be this string, though I'll give you a little handy hint generally, which is like, don't do that because you'll just have to change it later. So I'd strongly recommend you make your token just like a simple object that contains like one item, which is just the session ID, but you can kind of do whatever you want, frankly. Like you give the front end a token and it gives you back a token. You know, you could make it anything. You could make it an object of objects or just anything really that's JSON serializable is probably what I'd say. Yeah, the session can be random. It can also be sequential. Generally in a real world application, it wouldn't be sequential because then someone could guess it right. It's like if you just have session IDs that are like 123, 124, 125, 126, someone logs in twice, they see their session IDs like 124, 127. Has anyone ever done that? I'll tell you a fun trick. If your friends ever send you photos, like if you ever have friends that send you selfies or something, and they send you a couple of selfies, if you go look through the metadata of the photo, usually it'll give you like a raw file name. Sometimes it'll say something. It's very funny. They'll be like, oh, here's 2 photos I took of me, and it'll say like image like 123 .jpeg, and other times it'll say like 129.jpeg, and you're like, oh, okay. Well, they were all generated sequentially, so they probably took like 5 photos in between there and just didn't want to share it with you because they don't trust you or like you very much or something like that. So, you know, this is the thing with when you see sequential stuff, it's like you can derive a pattern and you can guess what's next, which isn't really good from like a security perspective, right? But we're not super fussed on that in the course. But generally random is fine. Like you can just Google random number generator JavaScript, and there'll be whole bunches of stuff. So I'd suggest random, but like it has no bearing on your actual coursework or anything like that. So don't lose any sleep over it. I'm reaching the end of this, and we're at 7:39. Are there any questions? Like speak now in the next 30 seconds, or you'll be posting on the forum. Just some words of advice before we wrap up with the questions, if there are any. Don't stress about the TypeScript component. I know this example here has like typing on a lot of the variable names, but generally speaking, the way we've set up the project, you can run your server without having to type stuff. It's just you won't pass the TSC command later on, sometimes, depending on the case. So you can even skip this conversion step in terms of changing. All you have to do is actually change the file name, generally speaking. You can get away with a lot, so don't get caught up on that. Daniel has a question that I missed, which was, what's this catch error and next error? We're going to talk about exceptions next lecture. We're probably not going to talk about things too extensively on like what that is. There's a little bit to unpack on what that next is, but we'll talk about the try and catch next lecture. All I'd say is that when you write routes, they can be as simple as you've seen in all of the week 4 examples. So you can just go and write routes with, you know, the .get and the .post and everything like that. You don't need to do anything more than that. Yeah, cool. Okay. Well, that's it for tonight. If you do have any other questions, please post on the forum or talk to your tutor. Make sure you start iteration 2 this week. Make sure you make a good start this week. If you can start before your class with your tutor, and therefore you can have some smart questions for them, I promise you your life is going to be like 3 times easier over the next week or so. So please take that into account. And for those of you who ignore me anyway, I'm sure you'll find a way as long as you just try and make a start before week 6. If you do not feel like you are underway come next Monday, there's a good chance you're going to struggle. So please get stuck into it. The next 2 weeks are where the course starts to turn from 85% good students to like good groups to like groups that just fell off the wagon and groups that stayed strong. So, you know, ask yourself very deeply what you and your group members would like to be in terms of which half you'd like to be in there. So other than that, thank you. Obviously, as always, if you could leave some feedback. If you could be bothered, that would be great. Have a good evening, and let us know if you need any help. Thank you, everyone.